Mr. Fox, tell us, just as nearly as you can, just what you thought of the war when you heard of the declaration of war by Japan. I mean the attack of the Japanese planes upon Pearl Harbor last Sunday.
I was stunned. At first, I didn't believe it.
You did not believe it at first. Well, after that period left you, then what did you think about it?
Oh, I'd say it was one of feeling of fury and anger that we had been betrayed.
Well, of course, it was a shock. We just got in from a hike Sunday afternoon. Along came these headlines that war had been declared on the United States by Japan. It just didn't seem right that Japan should be the one to make the attack. I would have expected an attack on the Atlantic first.
I think our Secretary of State must have been asleep if we were betrayed.
Martin, it seemed here in the Middle West that we couldn't quite realize the greatness of this project that the Japs had started. We all felt that it was just maybe propaganda, newspaper talk.
It is my understanding, in the things I've read and the veterans I talked to, that leading up to prior to the attack on 7 December, that the American public really did not want to be involved with World War II. Earlier, I believe it was early 1941, FDR approved and signed into law the Lend-Lease Act, and that was a way for us to remain neutral. And I've heard rumors and stories of polls that may have been taken that were anywhere from 80-20 to 90-10. The American citizens did not want to be involved in the war. And then, of course, the attack on 7 December would change that.
After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the American people were left in shock and anger. Paired with early losses in the Pacific Theater, morale both overseas and at home hit rock bottom in the early stages of 1942. Led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, a daring carrier-launched bombing raid on the Japanese mainland proved to be America's reaction to Japanese provocation. Despite the strike's limited strategic value, it triggered a psychological revolution to American morale, turning defeat into determination. In the weeks following Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt and his military leaders began devising a plan to strike the Japanese mainland. However, an issue quickly arose. The military lacked a carrier-launched aircraft with the range and offensive capabilities the raid called for. The proposed solution was a joint operation between the Navy and Army Air Forces employing B-25 Mitchells launched off the USS Hornet. U.S. Army Air Forces Commander General Henry Arnold selected Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle to handle the planning for the raid.
The airplanes they were using were brand new. I believe most of the models were all 1941 tail numbers or early 1942 tail numbers. So they had only been made just a few months before. Number one. Number two, the Army was going to attempt something that never was actually done before in combat, and that was American Army Air Force bombers taking off from a deck of a carrier. And they're going to do it with brand new airplanes.
On the 3rd of February, Doolittle proved the plan was realistic by launching 2 B-25s from a carrier off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia. However, a whole new set of problems immediately arose. Despite being able to take off from them, pilots found it very difficult to land B-25s on carrier decks. Thus, the raid planners were forced to depend on the pilots' ability to push the bombers all the way to either unoccupied China or friendly Soviet territory. This was pushing the range limits of the aircraft to its limit, to say the least. Maintainers were forced to cut weight in order to preserve fuel by any means possible, famously replacing the rear turret guns with painted broomsticks. The highly classified standard B-25 bomb sights were deemed too risky to bring along due to the mission's possibility of failure, so they were replaced by a cheap alternative that may have been even more effective because of the raid's low altitude. On April 1st, the USS Hornet, loaded up with the mission's modified B-25s, departed San Francisco, accompanied by 2 cruisers, a tanker, and 4 destroyers, and was additionally joined by the USS Enterprise closer to the strike distance. Doolittle hoped to launch around 400 miles away from the Japanese mainland, but on the morning of April 18th, a patrol boat was able to spot and transmit a warning to Japanese personnel before being sunk by the American task group, forcing Doolittle and Co. to launch approximately 820 miles from Tokyo. Splitting up upon landfall, the strike groups approached their targets at extremely low altitudes before eventually climbing to around 1,200 feet, releasing their payloads, then returning to low altitude. Nearly all targets were reported as successfully struck, from the greater Tokyo area to Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. The raiders faced little aerial Japanese resistance, and despite reported intense anti-aircraft fire, nothing was accurate enough to take out one of the bombers or any American personnel on board. Of the 16 crews, 13 made it to friendly territory, unfortunately suffering 3 fatalities during bailouts. One crew was short on fuel and forced to land in Soviet Vladivostok, eventually returning home through an elaborate collaboration with the Soviets, who were not yet at war with the Japanese. 2 crews were captured by Japanese forces in China. 1 died of dysentery in captivity, 3 were executed in 1942, and 4 survived to be liberated at the end of the war. Despite limited damage to the Japanese war machine, the raid had the exact effect its planners intended. The prospect of American carriers within striking distance of the Japanese mainland forced Japan to react by pulling resources from offensive campaigns in order to focus troops on defending the seas closer to home. As Britannica's article on the Doolittle raid puts it, quote, "The reality of American bombers in Tokyo's skies forced Japan to accelerate the expansion of the defensive perimeter," end quote. But perhaps more importantly, the raid marked a psychological turning point in morale on both sides. American troops had finally scored a victory overseas, proving that the Japanese military that had seemed so comprehensive was not quite invincible. Reinvigorated by the revolutionary show of force, enlistment rates rose and factory production skyrocketed. Although pinning the United States' victory over Japan in World War II entirely on the relative success of the Doolittle raid is naive, the efficiency of the American fighting force was strengthened enough to turn the tide of the war much sooner. The significance of the raid was perhaps demonstrated most in the widely recognized turning point of the war in the Pacific. During the Battle of Midway, taking place just 2 months after Doolittle's strike, the American Navy flexed its newfound strength and drive, sinking 4 Japanese carriers and downing 320 aircraft. The Japanese Navy never fully recovered, and by 1945, the Japanese Empire, with American forces closing in on all sides, officially surrendered. The significance of the Doolittle raid is often disputed amongst historians. Since its tangible impact was so little compared to the deadly firebombing campaigns that followed, any effect it had on history was almost entirely symbolic. At the same time, it is difficult to say that about the estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians that were killed during the Japanese retaliation in China for helping the raiders escape. Without the Doolittle raid, would the Chinese populace have been decimated and marginalized the way that it was? Looking at it the other way, if the United States hadn't reacted to Pearl Harbor in such a bold way, would its military ever have been inspired enough to take the war back to Japan? Regardless of whether the collateral damage resulting from the Japanese retaliation was worth it, the American reaction to the attack on Pearl Harbor, displayed in the Doolittle raid, revolutionized morale and helped turn the tide of the war in the Pacific.